Okay, more about emotions. Customer service, it turns out, could be an expense. It turns out it could be a hassle to have to answer the phone, to give someone their money back, etc. The other way to think about it, though, is it could be a chance of a lifetime. At McDonald's, they have a policy, at least they did when I was in business school. If you go to McDonald's and buy a Big Mac and a milkshake, and then sit down and eat half the Big Mac and drink half the milkshake, and then take the rest of the Big Mac and put it in the milkshake and bring it to the counter and say, I can't drink this, there's a Big Mac in it, they will give you your money back. And that's exactly what you'd want them to do for two reasons. One, because the poor fast food frontline worker really hasn't been trained and really can't be trusted to use excellent brand judgment as to who's giving them a hard time and who's not. Just tell them that's the policy. But more important is this. If someone's willing to go to the trouble of walking up to the counter and complaining, they are open in that moment to either not liking you or getting closer to you. And the way they're going to get closer to you is when you look them in the eye and say, thank you for being here. Thank you for talking to me. I am not going to argue with you about your perception of the milkshake. I'm just going to tell you I trust you and I can't wait for you to be my customer again. And that mindset uses customer service as a storytelling medium. When Zappos started with Tony Hsieh at the helm, it was a shoe store, an online shoe store. What's a shoe store worth? Right? In the real world, all shoe stores are small. None are particularly valuable. He sold it for almost $1 billion. Why? What did he use? He used only one marketing technique, customer service. That there were policies in place and, more important, a culture in place that made the people at Zappos eager to talk to you. The record, I think, is an 8.5-hour-long phone call where someone called Zappos and stayed on the phone for 8.5 hours with one of the customer service reps. Most places have a policy that the person has to hang up. How many calls can you do a day? Tony's like, look, if you're willing to spend the time talking to Zappos, I'm willing to spend the time to talk to you. Buy 18 pairs of shoes at Zappos, ship 18 pairs back, fine with them. Because if you understand that they're the kind of people who do business with you in a way that's based on trust, you are more likely to trust them. The flip side of this differentiation thinking is our next word, which is commodities. If you make a commodity, why are you surprised that we're not going to pay extra? If you make a commodity, why are you surprised that no one cares about what you make? Someone needs to make commodities. Someone needs to make undifferentiated, replaceable, fungible stuff. But it doesn't have to be you. And it's only a commodity if you treat it that way. Who would have thought that bottled water was going to cost dollars, not pennies, right? It's water. It used to be a commodity. It's not a commodity anymore because they stopped treating it that way. So back to your story, this idea that you can say, no, it's not a commodity and here is why. Well, the why is what's going to determine whether or not we believe you. Next one. Fear. Now, I hinted at this at the beginning, but it's so frightening to talk about that I sort of postponed it, which is this. Particularly in business-to-business selling, most people don't buy stuff because they seek delight. They buy stuff, they pay attention anyway, because they seek to avoid failure. They seek to avoid getting in trouble. They seek to avoid having their boss be angry at them. So in B2B selling, the person's asking themselves only one question. What will I tell my boss? That when you want to have an interview with them, when you want to find out what they're interested in, when you want to sell them something in their head, they are thinking, fine, I trust this person, they were well referred, I've heard of this brand, whatever it is. And then it's, what will I tell my boss? So if their boss's goal is to cut the cost of every widget they make, and you're sitting there selling something that's going to cut the cost of widgets, they're interested. But more often it might be, why did you screw up? Why did you buy from someone we can't trust? Why did you buy something new that got us in trouble? What was wrong with the old thing? And so fear keeps entering into this. The idea that we need to find out what this new thing is, because if you don't know what it is when your boss asks you, you will regret it. That we need to switch to this thing because that company is having supply chain problems and this one has a transparent supply chain. Again, we're touching on basic human emotions. The desire to be wanted and needed. The desire to be delighted. And the desire to avoid things that are going to get us in trouble. Because most people with a stable job are filled with fear that it won't stay stable. They'd like to move up, but most of all, they'd like to not get kicked out. So as we think of what we sell and how we sell it, we have to think deeply about human desires and whether they're at work or not at work, how do those kick in? Okay, the next one is licensing. If you've got a pair of fancy eyeglasses with, Giorgio Armani, Tommy Hilfiger, some famous brand on them, they were not made by the people whose name is on the side. They were actually made by Luxottica, a company in Italy that makes almost all the eyeglasses that are out there. In fact, there are lots of products in our lives that look like they're from one company that are actually from somebody else. One of the opportunities that we have as marketers is not to invent a whole story from scratch, but to find someone who has a story and go license it. Pay them money in exchange for putting their story on what we make. Now, there are upsides and downsides of this. The upside, obviously, is it's faster. The downside is they own it, not you. So you're going to have to think, again, with your team about what happens here. Back when I had my first job at Spinnaker Software, we were the number 1 company that made educational computer games for kids. And what we did was we had a meeting to figure out who could beat us. Who did we have to worry about that would come along that would get us in trouble? And it turned out Fisher-Price had a brand name that was priceless. No pun intended. So we called them up and we licensed their brand name and we became our own biggest competitor. So we had Spinnaker games over here and Fisher-Price games over here. By doing that, we were dealing with different worldviews. Some parents wanted to buy a computer game from a company they never heard of that was geeky and techy and new. And some parents wanted to buy a game from Fisher-Price because it was trusted and risk-free and probably worth a few extra dollars. As the creator of both, we didn't care which one you bought. Same to us, but by licensing it, we were able to move forward. So back to this worldview issue, we end up with this discussion then of risk. Risk isn't real almost all the time. The perception of risk is real. That we are more afraid of being afraid. That we don't like dancing with fear. So when a new brand comes into the world, when a new marketing idea comes into the world, the perception of risk looms large. Let's think about the launch and growth of Twitter. Twitter was a failure for almost 2 years. Not very many people were using Twitter. The magic thing they did was concentrate the population at South by Southwest one year so that there were enough people there who were on Twitter that the people who weren't on Twitter felt fear. And the fear they felt was, I am being left out. People are on Twitter talking about me and I can't see what they are saying. And so they owned that conference. They owned that moment. And all of those people then went home and repeated the process again. That getting to critical mass becomes critical. Because if people are worried about being left out, your market concentration, not among everyone, but among the weird, becomes critical. Because again, it's going back to the fundamentally human dialogue we have running in the back of our head.